Welcome back to the Motivational Reading Podcast, where we review and comment on the latest chapter covered in motivational reading. Just a reminder, when you check on the channel, the blue thumbnails are these commentaries, and the red ones are the videos of the full audio reading of the chapter we are covering. In this episode, we are covering Part 2, Chapter 4 of How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. In this chapter, we read about principle number 4. Be a good listener. Encourage others to talk about themselves. And Mr. Carnegie starts off the chapter, as he always does, in bold with this title: An Easy Way to Become a Good Conversationalist. Mr. Carnegie loves to use all sorts of real-life examples. So in this example that I'm sharing today is a story about a botanist. So the setting is Mr. Carnegie was at a dinner party in New York where he met a distinguished botanist. And he had said that he'd never met a botanist before. And so throughout the conversation that he had with this botanist, he listened intently about exotic plants, experiments in new plant life development, and even about the common potato. Mr. Carnegie spent the entire time with the botanist that evening. And at the end of the evening, after Mr. Carnegie had left, the botanist had made some comments to the host about him. He said that Mr. Carnegie was a most interesting conversationalist. Why? Why did the botanist call Mr. Carnegie a most interesting conversationalist? Number one, Mr. Carnegie had said hardly anything at all. He listened intently because he was genuinely interested. And the botanist felt his interest. And I'd like to read a direct quote from the book. And this is Mr. Carnegie speaking. I told him that I had been immensely entertained and instructed. And I had. I told him I wished I had his knowledge. And I did. I told him that I should love to wander the fields with him. And I have. I told him I must see him again. And I did. Pretty cool. It's just really trying to emphasize here, I believe, the honesty and the genuineness of his interest in what the botanist had to say. Mr. Carnegie goes on throughout the chapter giving a few more examples, and this is one example that I liked, talking about what is a good listener. On this next slide, I'd like to talk about what Mr. Carnegie defines as a good listener. He's giving examples, one in backing up what he said around the botanist, and the other is from Charles W. Eliot, a former Harvard president. So this first part, if you're looking at the slides highlighted in yellow, let me read this first. And so I had him thinking of me as a good conversationalist, when in reality, I had been merely a good listener and had encouraged him to talk. So referring back to what I said on the last slide, he was trying to share his honesty and genuineness of how interested he was in what the botanist had to say. And this is the confirmation, just saying he wasn't really necessarily a good conversationalist. He just was very interested, and that's what made him be a good listener and encouraged the botanist to talk. Now, Mr. Eliot, I'm also going to read this part from the book. Eliot himself was a past master of the art of listening. Henry James, one of America's first great novelists, recalled, Dr. Eliot's listening was not mere silence, but a form of activity. Sitting very erect on the end of his spine with his hands joined in his lap, making no movement except that he revolved his thumbs around each other faster or slower. He faced his interlocutor and seemed to be, and listen to this part, hearing with his eyes as well as his ears. So this part I wanted to pull out just because it's another good example of what Mr. Carnegie is defining as a good listener. But you really can imagine someone sitting at the edge of their seat with their back straight and maybe tilted forward towards you, and hearing with his eyes as well as his ears. I had to highlight that part because I thought that was very interesting. If you can be staring at someone, eyeballing them, or actually looking like you're intently listening, and that's what I kind of got from this paragraph that I just shared. So how do you try to be a good listener? And I tried to think of some examples that I've used. I would say this is definitely an area that I need to improve on. So let me just give you 3 pieces of my examples. Number 1, I try to repeat back what I just heard to show the other person that I'm engaged. So I'll say something like, so you're saying this, or this, just to confirm that I really understand, and also to let them know that I am listening and paying attention to what they're saying to me. I do keep eye contact, and I do find it's a fine line between eyeballing someone and actually showing interest in the eye contact. So I really love that last example I showed on the last slide of Mr. Elliott. And then thirdly, if I accidentally get off track, which I do often, I'll try to ask a question like, hey, let's go back to what you were saying about your trip to Guatemala or something like that. That's what I have here on the slide. So what you were saying earlier, tell me a little bit more about that. I'll try to jump back into a conversation that way if I see that I've gotten off track or if the other person got off track somehow as well. So what are some examples you have? Put some of your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear them. And on this next slide is some detail on being a good listener. I'm not going to drain the slide, but let me talk about some of the highlights here. There's 3 other pieces of advice. Give your full attention, number 1. Make a conscious effort to give them your full attention. And feel free to pause the video right now and take a screenshot if you would like to read through this. Number 2, practice active listening. Show that you are engaged in the conversation by nodding, using verbal affirmations like, I see or I understand, and asking relevant questions. So asking questions that are relevant to what the person's talking about. And then number 3, avoid interrupting or jumping to conclusions. This is a problem I have, and I need to really work on this. Resist the urge to interrupt or finish the speaker's sentences. You know, like when you really almost know for sure what they're going to say and they're having a hard time getting it out, but it's obvious that they're thinking about it. That's my problem, is right there I always like to try to finish the other person's sentence, but you never know what they might come up with. So I think this is a really great piece of advice. So that's going to conclude this podcast on chapter 4. And just remember, an easy way to become a great conversationalist is to get others to talk about themselves. So a quick review of what we've talked about and studied about together so far. In part 2, 6 ways to make people like you. Principle number 1, become genuinely interested in other people. Principle 2, smile. Principle 3, a person's name is to that person the sweetest and important sound in any language. And principle number 4, be a good listener. Encourage others to speak about themselves. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great week ahead of you. Thank you.